I grew up in United States, so I identify as a Tibetan American because my cultural upbringing has been a mixture of the both culture. I just finished my master's, and I will continue with my PhD in cultural anthropology with a focus on contemporary Tibetan lives. Here, this is a thriving Tibetan community, so nobody necessarily has to explain themselves as Tibetan. In the States, where there weren't so many Tibetans around, and I went to a school predominantly with no Tibetans, so I was hyper aware of my identity because people would ask, what nationality are you? And that's a funny question because I'm Tibetan. I identify as Tibetan nationally, but then I would have to explain how it's not necessarily an existing sovereign state. It's been colonized by China. So from a young age, I had to be super conscious of what this meant. And I think that experience as a young kid bothered me a lot, so I used to do a lot of reading on what did happen to Tibet. Like, of course, I got small pictures from my parents telling me the story, including like personal narratives in terms of how my parents came. My mom was born in Tibet, and my father was on the border. He was actually being carried out when Tibet was being invaded, especially like fully colonized by 1959. So those experiences always made me want to know more. Why did things happen? When I was younger, I got super involved in Students for a Free Tibet, which is an organization based in the United States. And I used to be very involved in their campaigns, but I think I decided to take on more of a personal initiative when I decided to go back to school. I took 4 years off after I graduated, and then I realized that there was a lot of frustrations when it came to international media or whenever Tibet was covered in any medium, especially in popular medium. It's always these stereotypical versions of the story, or very decontextualizing stories of what happened to Tibet. So I was always frustrated with those stories, especially when they did not include contemporary issues that Tibetans are continuing to live through. So I wanted to take on academia so I can produce more narratives that take on a different look on what does Tibetan lives look like, especially in the context of exile, because people don't think once you make it out of Tibet, you're done with Chinese colonization, but they don't necessarily think of how Chinese, not just colonial powers, but imperial moves when it comes to politics and economics can have an effect on host nations that actually host refugee communities. I was in college, and there was already an SFT operating there, and like I said, when I was younger, I was heavily involved in SFT, which I would credit as awakening my national consciousness as far as what does history have to do with Tibet's situation in the present situation. One of them has been through my chosen path to be one of the narrators. There needs to be multiple narrators when it comes to, as far as stuff written on Tibet, you don't hear a lot of Tibetans talking about Tibetan experiences, both past and the present. So I want to be one of those voices that talk about these issues. India needs to pay attention to its borders. Obviously, there's already been border intrusions. There has been diplomatic meetings, but China has not been that honest as far as border excursions are considered. I also think there needs to be more attention paid to how the resources in Tibet is being utilized. I think water is extremely important for South Asia. And I think also the fact that China is becoming an economic power, imperial power, and India needs to take notice, because as big as China is, India is growing fast too. And it has economic interest with China. And I think India needs to, as much as think about growing India nationally and economically, they need to also think about how China could easily turn that relationship into an imperial one. Well, I think in the current moment, when there's geopolitical wars breaking out all over Middle East with Western aggression, Islamophobia, all of that is producing mass numbers of refugees. And I think people have forgotten about refugees, especially after World War II, when there was mass numbers of refugees coming in, and then different nations hosting these refugees, trying to understand how to get these refugees working in their nation state, right? So, America saw a mass migration. Right? So, I think in the current moment, similar things are happening, but, of course, these wars don't talk as much about the kind of refugees that they're producing. But I think there needs to be an interest paid on how not only are these wars producing refugees, but they're producing these lifestyles, marginalized lifestyles. And these people are walking around paperless, and their whole life structure has been destroyed, right? Because of capitalist interest. And I think the present context of Tibet is important in understanding. People love to isolate Tibet because it's so romantic, but I don't think people understand how, for example, like the Tibetan community in India is especially successful at, sustaining themselves, rebuilding and restarting, and then sustaining a fully functioning community. Granted that there's been also these other destabilizing things like rights, right? I think there is, as far as people who are interested in understanding Tibet in a universalistic theme, I think they need to understand more of the context of refugeehood. What does it mean? What does it do to the psyche? It's not just about sustaining lives, but it's also like what kind of community are you going to produce out of all of this rubble, and how are you going to sustain yourself? And so I think from that point of view, Tibet becomes an interesting situation because we're both a story of survival, of continuity, and of suffering, right? But it's also a celebration too, because we continue to, move forward and produce I think Dharamsala is a pretty successful refugee community. But as far as being a contemporary Tibetan, I think my work itself speaks for, my existence. Because there's not a lot of writing on Tibetan Americans, for example, and what kind of lives that they're starting over there, right? And I also don't think there's a lot of young Tibetans specifically talking about Tibetan lives in the current context. And I think the fact that I'm doing that is something new, and it's not because I'm doing it alone. I think there's a generation of Tibetans that are doing that. Like, I'm seeing a lot of young people doing all these different initiatives to narrate their life stories that are so different but so similar at the same time, and to talk about how our lives, we continue to live on this existence and continue to strive, right? So it's exciting to live in this time period. I think it's right now it's a new era where young people, or young Tibetans especially, are not only narrating their own stories, but doing it in extremely creative and through many different mediums. And you got to know me through the blog, right? So the fact that you can learn about Tibetan lives through our own stories to understand a larger political situation, it's a very new thing, and I'm excited about it.